I've never been one to shy away from the unknown. Curiosity has always been my companion, even when it has led me into places I should never have gone. But standing here now, at the edge of the labyrinth, I can't help but feel a cold tremor in my chest. The air is thick with something ancient, something alive, and I can feel it pressing against me from all sides. The kingdom is quieter than I've ever known it. The streets that were once bustling with merchants and townsfolk are now deserted, eerily silent, as if the very life has been sucked from them. It's been days since the labyrinth appeared in the heart of the kingdom, an impossibility of stone and shadow that no one can explain. They say no one has returned from it. Those who enter vanish without a trace, swallowed whole by the twisting corridors, lost forever to whatever malevolent force waits inside. But I can't turn away. I never could. I've been walking toward it for hours, drawn to it like a moth to the flame. The labyrinth calls to me and I cannot help but answer. Not because I believe it will offer me answers, I'm no fool, but because of something deeper, a pull that I've felt since I was a child. My father disappeared, vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but his unfinished maps. There has to be a connection between him and this place. I know it. I feel it. His maps are all I have left of him. Every day I pore over the intricate lines, the sketches, the cryptic notes that have only raised more questions than they've answered. He was a cartographer, my father, obsessed with the world's edges, the places where no one else dared go. And yet, in the end, it was that obsession that took him from me. The labyrinth. It had to be the key. I stand now at its entrance, feeling the weight of what lies beyond. The stone walls rise before me like the jagged teeth of some great beast, their blackened surface slick with moisture, absorbing the light from the dying sun. The mist that coils around the base of the labyrinth clings to my feet, as if trying to hold me back. But I push forward, knowing that there's no turning back now. Not when I've come this far. Above the archway, I catch a glimpse of something. An inscription, barely visible through the fog. The words are faint, worn by time, but they send a shiver down my spine. This is not a place of entry, it is a place of loss. I don't know what that means, but it feels as if the words have been carved into my very soul. Loss. That's a word I've come to know all too well. I've lost so much, and now, as I step forward, I wonder if I'll lose more. The cold grips me harder as I take my first step inside, the stone beneath my boots rough and unyielding. The labyrinth is still, but I know it's alive. I can feel it. It shifts with me, watching me, waiting for my next move. The air grows colder, more oppressive, with every footfall I take. I glance over my shoulder, just for a moment, and the entrance is gone. Gone. In its place are only more walls, stretching into the fog, closing in around me. No way out, no escape. A chill runs down my spine. It's as if the labyrinth swallowed me whole the moment I stepped inside. The walls groan, as if they've sensed my fear, and I hear the faintest scrape, a sound just on the edge of my consciousness. My heart stutters. Was it a whisper? A voice? I turn, but there's no one, just shadows. I push forward, gripping the map my father left me. The familiar strokes of ink feel like a lifeline in my shaking hands. But when I unfold it, I find myself staring at a mess of lines, twisted and warped, as though the labyrinth itself has already begun to twist the very reality around me. Nothing is as it should be. The path before me stretches into two directions, both equally dark, equally impossible to decipher. But I know that if I hesitate too long, the walls will shift again. They always do. The labyrinth doesn't care about directions or choices. It just cares about you. your fears, your regrets, the things you're running from. I feel something stir deep inside me, an unease I can't name. I've always been afraid of being alone, of being abandoned. It's something I've carried with me my whole life, and the labyrinth knows it. It's using it against me. I can feel it in the way the walls tighten around me, the way the air seems to close in on my chest. And then, as if in answer to that fear, I hear a voice. Ren. My heart lurches in my chest. The voice is faint, so faint it could be my imagination, but it's unmistakable. I know that voice. It's his. It's my father's voice. Father? I whisper, my voice barely a breath. I turn, my eyes searching the shadows, my pulse racing. Please, let it be real. But there's nothing, no figure, no man, just the same cold stone and swirling mist. The voice comes again, softer this time, but clearer. You should not be here. My blood runs cold. I feel my stomach twist into knots. I know it now. The labyrinth isn't just a structure, it's a presence, it's alive, and it knows me. It knows my fears, my weaknesses. It is playing with my mind, manipulating me, and I am falling for it. I try to steady myself. I can't let it win. I have to keep moving. I have to get deeper, find the truth, find my father, and understand what this place is before it takes everything from me. But as I take another step, the walls seem to close in tighter, their cold surface pressing against my skin, and the whispers grow louder. I feel them now, crawling through my head like insects. Voices, memories, the labyrinth feeding on my confusion, on my very existence. My breath catches. I think of the things I've forgotten, the faces, the moments, the parts of me that have begun to fade in the depths of this place. It's erasing me. I stumble forward, unable to stop, the pull of the maze stronger than any rational thought. There's no turning back, not anymore. The labyrinth has already begun to claim me, and I can feel its hunger. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. The weight. The air thickened, pressing against me like invisible hands, squeezing tighter with every step I took. A low hum resonated through the stone walls, deep and unsettling, vibrating through my bones as if the labyrinth itself was alive, watching me. The darkness inside wasn't like the simple absence of light, it was a presence, oppressive, suffocating. I could feel it crawling over my skin, reaching into my lungs, tightening around my chest, making it harder to breathe. I turned back once, just a glance, hoping to see the world I had left behind, the town, the streets, anything familiar. But it was already gone. The entrance had vanished, swallowed up by the dark stone that now surrounded me. There was no going back, no escape. My heart hammered in my chest, the walls closing in as if they were deliberately sealing me inside. The only sound was the echo of my own footsteps, each one swallowed by the silence that stretched endlessly ahead. The floor beneath my boots was slick with something cold and damp, and the air, thick with the smell of earth and decay, burned my nostrils. It was as if I was walking into the belly of something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting for me for a long time. I tried to steady myself, to focus on my map, my father's map. I fumbled with it in my hands, desperate for some sense of direction, some trace of familiarity. But when I opened it, my heart dropped. The lines, once so precise, so deliberate, were now tangled and crooked, bending in on themselves. The paths no longer made sense. My eyes blurred as I scanned the paper, but no matter how hard I looked, nothing seemed right. The labyrinth was already changing. I gripped the map tighter, but it slipped from my hands, the paper now damp and curling at the edges. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as the walls around me seemed to shift, subtly but undeniably. The labyrinth was alive. It was reacting to me, to my fears, my confusion. I forced myself to take another step, even as the unease gnawed at my insides, clawing at my throat. The walls stretched up and around me, towering like giants, their surfaces smooth, almost too smooth, like polished obsidian. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold stone, and the instant I touched it, I felt something surge through me, something sharp, like a prickling electric current that ran up my arm and settled in my chest, making my heart race. I jerked my hand back, a sense of dread blooming inside me, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. The path split ahead, 2 directions, one to the left, one to the right. Both were equally dark, equally impenetrable. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Which way? The labyrinth had already bent reality. Which choice would keep me from losing myself entirely? But as I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, the walls groaned. A soft, shuddering sound that seemed to vibrate through the very core of the stone. And then came the whisper. Ren. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, my heart leaping in my throat. My father's voice. There was no mistaking it. The deep, familiar timbre, laced with something hauntingly distant. Distant enough to twist my gut into knots. Father? I choked out the word, barely able to breathe, as if the sound of it might shatter the fragile illusion of sanity that clung to me. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just shadows, and the endless, oppressive maze stretching into the distance. I could still hear it, the whisper of his voice, softer now, almost tender, but laced with a warning that scraped against my soul. You shouldn't be here, the voice repeated. I couldn't stop myself. I took a step forward, my heart pounded in my chest as I moved deeper, my legs trembling beneath me. Every instinct screamed to turn and run, but the pull of the maze was stronger, drawing me in. I had to know, I had to understand. What was this place? What had happened to my father? I forced myself to move forward. The damp, cold air thickened my lungs as I pressed on. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to close in, as though the labyrinth was deliberately tightening around me, squeezing the life from the space. It was then that I noticed the door. It appeared out of nowhere. A rough archway in the stone, faintly outlined in shadow. I couldn't tell if it had always been there, or if it had manifested in response to my growing dread. I approached it cautiously, my hand hovering just above the frame, as if it might bite me, as if it were a trap. My breath caught in my throat as the air seemed to thicken around the door, the very weight of it pressing against my chest. Without thinking, I reached for it. The instant my fingers brushed the cold stone, a sharp pain shot through me. A searing, electric jolt that spread through my arm and up to my chest, like being struck by lightning. My fingers numbed, and I yanked my hand back, heart racing in terror. The door was not just a door. It was a barrier, a warning. I staggered backward, the ground beneath me buckling as if the entire labyrinth was shifting. The walls groaned again, louder this time, as if they were alive and angry. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. The labyrinth was watching me, studying me, feeding on my fear. The ground beneath me trembled, and I had no choice but to turn and keep moving deeper into the maze because that was the only option. Another whisper. My name. Louder now, clearer. Ren. It was close. Too close. My head whipped around, but there was no one there. No figure, no shape, just shadows, and the oppressive stone. The walls groaned again, the sound vibrating through my bones, and the map fluttered in my hands, pages flapping wildly. It was useless. The lines had faded entirely. There was no pattern now, no plan. I was lost. And then, I understood. The labyrinth wasn't just a place. It wasn't just stone. It was alive. It fed off my doubts, my fears, my very existence. It was warping everything, consuming me as it consumed the world around me. I had no idea how to escape. And worse, I didn't know if I even wanted to anymore. I was already lost. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. No, not just wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't understand. The deeper I went, the more the labyrinth seemed to consume me. Every step I took felt heavier, like the weight of the stone around me was growing, pressing in on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows thicker. Time blurred. I could no longer remember when I'd entered. Had it been hours? Days? And then it happened. A sound. Faint at first. A whisper, barely a breath in the suffocating silence. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing, eyes darting to the darkness ahead of me. I strained to listen, my ears pricking for any sign of movement. The sound was distant, just out of reach, but I heard it again. A name. Wren. My breath hitched in my throat. It couldn't be. No, it was impossible. It wasn't real. My eyes scanned the empty passageways around me, my pulse quickening. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, to leave this place before it consumed me completely. But my body refused to obey. Instead, I stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, as though something invisible was dragging me closer, deeper into the labyrinth's embrace. The voice came again, closer now, louder, familiar. "Wren," it called, and this time there was no denying it. The voice was unmistakable. My father's voice. "Father?" The word slipped from my mouth before I could stop it, my throat tight with disbelief. I called out again, the silence pressing against me. "Father?" And then, from the shadows ahead, something shifted. A figure, barely visible at first, like a haze, a flicker of light and dark that danced at the edge of my vision. It was just a shape, distorted, wavering as though caught between two realities. But I knew. I knew what it was before it even fully formed. It was him. My father, Corvin. His image began to solidify, though he was not as I remembered him, not as he should have been. The ghostly figure of my father flickered in and out, like a fading memory, a projection cast by something beyond my understanding. His face was gaunt, pale, too pale, and his eyes, dark and hollow, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was a distance in them, something cold, something alien. Father. The word was barely a whisper as I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached for him, hoping, no, desperate, to make contact, to pull him from the shadows that seemed to swallow him whole. But before I could reach him, he flickered again, his form distorting like smoke caught in the wind. The coldness in his eyes deepened, and his voice, when it came, was thin and strained, barely audible over the growing hum of the labyrinth. "Wren," he said, and his voice was ragged, broken, as if speaking to me hurt him, as if it tore at the very fabric of his being. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, my heart skipping in my chest. "What are you talking about?" I croaked, my voice cracking. "Where did you go? Why did you leave me? Why did you— You don't understand," he interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, desperate. He took a step back, his form shifting, wavering in the air like a mirage. "I didn't leave you. I never wanted to leave you." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't read. Regret? Guilt? "I did what I had to, Wren. I had to protect you. From this place." I shook my head, confusion mixing with the anger that had been building in my chest for years. "What place?" I demanded, my hands clenched into fists. "What are you protecting me from? Why did you leave me here, alone, searching for you? Why didn't you just tell me?" Corvin's form wavered, a shadow dancing at the edge of my vision, his presence flickering like an old faded photograph. "I tried to protect you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, like the words were being dragged from him by some unseen force. "I built this labyrinth to keep you away, to keep you safe. But you—" He paused, his voice breaking, his eyes widening as if he were looking at me for the first time. "You shouldn't be here." The walls around us groaned, deep and resonant, as though the maze itself was reacting to the weight of his words. The air turned thick with an unsettling pressure, and I could feel my chest tighten, as if the labyrinth were closing in, suffocating me. The shadows shifted, twisting, curling into themselves, and I could hear whispers now, soft and indistinct, scraping at my mind like claws on stone. "What secret are you hiding, Father?" I pressed, desperate, my voice rising. "Why is this maze here? What did you lock away? What was so dangerous that you had to create this prison?" Corvin's face twisted in anguish, his form flickering violently as though the question had struck a chord he was unwilling to face. He looked away, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. "Please," he whispered, his voice strained, desperate. "You don't understand. You cannot know what I hid in here. The things that lie beneath. The things I protected you from." Before I could ask more, before I could demand answers, the maze around us shifted. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the walls groaned louder, as though the very labyrinth itself was alive and angry. I reached out, my hand trembling, but in that instant, Corvin's figure flickered once more, dissolving like mist in the wind. His eyes were the last to go, staring at me with an unreadable expression, the weight of his regret hanging in the air long after he vanished. "You should never have come here," his voice echoed, a fading whisper in the air, and then he was gone, vanished like a dream slipping away in the morning light. The maze swallowed his presence, and I was left standing in the cold, crushing silence, the only sound the ragged pounding of my heart in my chest. What was this place? What had my father hidden here? What was I walking into? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had learned only a fraction of the truth, and that what lay ahead, deeper in the maze, would be worse than anything I had imagined. But there was no turning back. The labyrinth had already claimed me. The labyrinth was closing in on me. With every step, the walls seemed to tighten, as if they were aware of my fear, feeding on it, drawing me deeper into their suffocating embrace. The shadows pressed in from all sides, the air thick and damp, heavy with the smell of earth and decay. I felt it, knew it. The maze was alive, twisting with a mind of its own, turning my thoughts against me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in short, frantic bursts. It had been hours, maybe days, since I'd entered, but I had no sense of time anymore. There was nothing but the maze, and the suffocating weight of the silence that clung to it. I stumbled through another narrow passage, the stone walls grinding against my skin, slick and cold, as though the labyrinth was breathing, pulsing with its own dark life. My thoughts, once sharp, were starting to blur, slipping through my fingers like sand. The maze was erasing me, piece by piece, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on to who I was. And then, just as the crushing weight of despair began to swallow me whole, I heard it. A rustling, faint at first. So soft, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it came again, this time unmistakable. The sound of movement. Something, or someone, shifting through the shadows ahead of me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. The maze had already stolen my path, stolen my will. I wasn't alone anymore. I forced my legs to move, hesitant, every step heavy with dread, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The labyrinth seemed to swallow every bit of light, leaving me with nothing but the echoes of my own footsteps and the whispers of something else. Something watching, waiting. And then, through the darkness, a figure appeared. At first, it was nothing more than a blur, a silhouette moving fluidly through the shadows. My hand instinctively went to the hilt of my knife, the only weapon I had left, though I wasn't sure if it would even do any good in a place like this. The figure stepped closer, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a woman. Her movements were graceful, almost predatory, like someone who had learned how to exist in a place where survival was all that mattered. She wore dark clothes, black leather armor that blended with the shadows, and her eyes gleamed with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. She wasn't afraid. She was in control. "Lost?" she asked, her voice smooth, calm, like she was asking me if I knew the time. "You look like you've been wandering for days." I didn't speak. I couldn't. My mind was too tangled, the labyrinth's influence still pressing down on me, making it hard to think, to focus. I just stared at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. How was she here? Was she real? Her lips curved upward, just the faintest hint of a smile, but there was no humor in it. "You don't speak much, do you?" She took a step closer, studying me with a look that was almost clinical. "You're not the first fool to wander in here," she said, her tone almost casual. "But you're the first to make it this far." Her words were like a slap, and something about them made the tension in my chest tighten. I wasn't alone. And for the first time since I'd entered this cursed maze, I wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. I swallowed hard, the dry knot in my throat making it hard to speak. "Who are you?" The words felt foreign, thick in my mouth, but I had to know. If she was here, alive, moving through this hell, then she must have some purpose, some reason for being here. She cocked her head to one side, studying me with that same unnerving gaze. "I'm Amara," she said, her voice low, edged with something I couldn't place. "And I've been in this damn maze longer than I care to admit." The name hung in the air for a moment, its weight sinking into my bones. Amara. There was a sharpness to her, a hardened edge to her demeanor that suggested she wasn't some lost soul, drifting through the labyrinth. She had purpose. She had survived. I didn't know whether to trust her, didn't know if I could. The maze had already twisted me into someone I didn't recognize, and I had no idea what she wanted from me. "Why are you here?" I finally managed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced around the maze, her eyes flicking over the walls as though she was studying them, looking for something, or maybe just waiting for the right moment. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until she spoke again, her voice just above a whisper, like she didn't want the maze to hear. "I'm not here to help you," she said, and my stomach dropped. "I'm here because I need something. Something the labyrinth wants to keep hidden. And I've learned that it takes more than just luck to survive in here. It takes knowing the rules." She turned back to me, her gaze sharp and calculating. "And right now, you don't know the rules, but you're going to learn them." I didn't speak. My mind was racing, and I was trying to piece together what she was saying. "I don't need your help," I said, my voice a little stronger than I felt. "I can figure this out. I can get out of here." Her lips curled into a grin, sharp and knowing. "No, you can't," she said, her voice suddenly cutting through the air with an edge that made my skin crawl. Not alone, you can't. The maze doesn't let people leave. It doesn't want you to leave. She stepped closer, and I instinctively took a half step back, my body on high alert. "But I can help you," she said, her voice softening, as though she was trying to coax me into something I wasn't sure I wanted. "For a price." My chest tightened. What price? What did she want? Why should I trust you? The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice strained, distrust heavy in my chest. "You could be leading me into another trap." She raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "You're right to be cautious. I'm not here to play the hero." Her smile faded, and for a moment her eyes seemed to darken, something older, something more dangerous flickering behind them. "But you don't have much of a choice. The maze doesn't give you options, Ren. It doesn't care who you are or what you want, it just wants you to lose yourself in it." She paused, her gaze narrowing as she took another step closer. "And right now, it's doing a damn good job of it." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. She wasn't wrong. The labyrinth was already warping me, twisting my mind, erasing pieces of me that I could never get back. The thought of wandering these halls alone, without any sense of who I was or where I came from, was more terrifying than anything else. "Fine," I said, the word leaving my mouth almost against my will. "What now?" Amara's smile returned, small but satisfied. "Now," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we start walking. And you listen." And for the first time since I stepped into the maze, I didn't feel completely alone. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something about Amara wasn't entirely what it seemed. Something was hiding behind her eyes. Something I couldn't trust. But in a place like this, maybe nothing could be trusted. I'd thought I understood what the maze was, or at least what it had seemed to be. Just a labyrinth of stone, twisting and shifting with no rhyme or reason. But as I stumbled deeper, something more sinister began to take shape. It wasn't just the walls that were alive, it was everything around me. The very air seemed to pulse with an awareness, as if the maze had a mind of its own. A mind that knew my every thought, my every fear, and was waiting to use them against me. Amara was walking ahead of me, her pace steady, but I could see the tightness in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting over her shoulder, scanning the shadows, the walls. I wasn't the only one feeling the weight of this place. I could sense her unease, though she was trying to hide it. We were both trapped, lost in this ever-shifting nightmare. "I can feel it," she murmured, almost to herself, though I heard her clearly. "The walls, they're tightening. The maze is reacting to us." I couldn't speak. I didn't have to. I felt it too. The walls were closer now, the air heavier. I could hear the faintest groans, the sound of the stone shifting, of something watching us. I felt like I was being suffocated by the very weight of this place, as though the labyrinth was inhaling with each breath I took, pulling me deeper into its depths. The path ahead stretched on, narrowing as we moved, the shadows growing thicker. The ground beneath my boots trembled, as though the very earth had begun to twist with the maze, folding in on itself. And then I heard something, faint at first, like a whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Ren." The voice, his voice, was so clear, so real, it stopped me dead in my tracks. I wanted to turn around, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It couldn't be him, it was impossible. But the name, it was my father's voice. Corvin. I was gasping for breath, my head spinning. No, not now, not here. This place was twisting my memories, bending my reality. It couldn't be real. "Ren, come closer." I heard it again, the voice growing louder, more insistent. I felt the walls press in even tighter, the air growing colder. The labyrinth was responding to my fear, twisting it, feeding on it. It wanted me to chase the ghost of my father, to confront the thing that had haunted me for as long as I could remember. Father? The word escaped my lips before I could stop it, shaky and uncertain. And then he appeared. At first, it was just a flicker, a dark shadow at the far end of the hall, but then it solidified, becoming more distinct. And there, standing in front of me, was the figure of my father, Corvin. His form shimmered, his features unclear, as if he were made of mist, barely holding together. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and there was a deep, bone-chilling sadness in them that made my stomach twist. He was there, but not. His form flickered, unstable, like a memory struggling to survive in the darkness. I could hardly breathe as I took a step toward him, my hands shaking as I reached out. "Father?" My voice trembled, almost a whisper, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. He didn't speak at first. He only stared at me, his eyes searching mine, filled with sorrow, with guilt. His lips moved, but his voice came out in a rasp, a whisper that sounded far away, like it was coming from the depths of the earth. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice strained, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Regret? Ren? This place? His words faltered, and he reached out, his hand trembling as though he could barely hold his form together. "You can't be here. I never wanted you to come. I was frozen, unable to move, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. The fear I had buried for so long, the fear of being abandoned, broke free, filling me up, drowning me in that hollow ache I'd carried with me for years. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and I could barely hear my own voice when I asked, "Why did you leave me? Where did you go?" Corvin's gaze dropped, and for a moment I thought he would answer, that maybe this nightmare would end with some kind of closure. But instead he shook his head, the shadows around him shifting, warping, as though the labyrinth itself was tearing him apart. "I had to protect you," he whispered, his voice a strained rasp, the words heavy with something unspeakable. "From this, from everything." "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice rising with the desperation that flooded me. "Why did you build it? Why did you leave me here alone?" He lifted his eyes to mine, and for the first time, I saw the pain there, the deep, infinite sorrow that haunted him. "I couldn't protect you from them," he said, the words slipping out like a confession. "I thought I was keeping you safe. But the labyrinth..." His voice cracked, and I could feel the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on me, on us. "It's not just stone and walls, it's a prison. And it wants you, Ren. It wants you to lose yourself, to become nothing." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I staggered back, my hands reaching for anything to steady myself, but there was nothing. The labyrinth was swallowing me, warping everything around me. "I had to keep you safe," Corvin repeated, his voice growing fainter, his form flickering more rapidly, like a candle that was flickering out. "But I couldn't, not from this." Before I could speak again, his figure dissolved, his body breaking apart like smoke caught in the wind. I could still hear him, though. His voice lingered in the air, his last words a fading echo in the walls of the maze. "You shouldn't have come here. Ren." And then he was gone. The silence that followed was worse than anything I had felt so far. It wasn't just the absence of his presence. It was the crushing weight of his words, the understanding that this maze wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a prison, built to protect some secret so dangerous that even my father had been consumed by it. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But the labyrinth was already tightening around me, squeezing the air from my lungs, the walls, the shadows. They were closing in, warping, feeding on the fear I couldn't hide. And just as the weight of it all began to crush me, I heard another sound. A whisper, soft and low, coming from just behind me. Amara. She was standing there, staring ahead, her expression unreadable. I knew something had changed in her too. The maze had gotten inside her mind, just as it had mine. And now we were both trapped in this place, forced to face whatever horrors the labyrinth had in store for us. And then, as if the walls themselves were listening, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder. "You're not alone." The maze had heard us, had felt our fear, and it was only just beginning. The maze had become more than just stone and shadow. It had become a living nightmare. The air around me thickened, a tangible pressure pressing down on my chest with every breath I took. My skin crawled as the wall shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though the maze were aware of my every movement, my every hesitation. It wasn't just a place, it was a presence, a force that fed on my fear, twisted my thoughts, and made every step a challenge to my very sanity. Amara walked ahead of me, her pace steady, but her eyes darting nervously, constantly scanning the shadows. The same sense of dread gnawed at her too. We both knew we were heading towards something terrible, and we didn't want to face it, but the maze didn't care. It was pushing us forward, herding us like cattle toward an inevitable end. We walked for what felt like hours, the corridors winding endlessly, narrowing, expanding, shifting in ways that defied logic. Time felt irrelevant here, warped by the maze's hungry grasp. The labyrinth was a living thing, devouring time, space, and memory. Every step we took seemed to dig us deeper into its twisted heart. And then we arrived. The walls parted, and suddenly the air was different. A heavy stillness hung over the chamber ahead, the kind of stillness that sets your heart pounding in your chest, a kind of silence that is never truly empty. The space stretched before us, vast and hollow, as though we had stepped into the belly of the maze itself. It felt wrong. The walls here were smoother, darker, alive somehow, pulsing with a quiet, terrible energy. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, as though the labyrinth itself had decided that this place, this heart, was its true center. At the center of the room was a pedestal, bathed in an unnatural glow. The light that emanated from it was soft, almost gentle, but the darkness in the corners of the chamber made that light feel out of place. It was a sickly, pulsating glow, rhythmically breathing in time with the quickening of my heart. On the pedestal rested an artifact, a dark, jagged object, pulsing with energy, its form shifting and changing as though it couldn't decide what it was. It beckoned me, pulling me forward with an irresistible force. I felt my hand reach out, almost without my consent, but Amara stepped between me and the pedestal, her eyes wide, her hand outstretched as though to stop me. "You don't know what it is, Ren," she whispered, her voice barely audible, tremulous with fear. "This is it, the heart of the maze. It's not what you think it is." I was frozen. My heart was racing, but my body moved on its own accord, drawn to the artifact like a moth to a flame. What was it? What was my father hiding here? Why had he created this hellish place? And why had I been pulled into it? Before I could touch it, before I could find the answers that haunted me, the ground beneath me trembled. A deep, rumbling growl reverberated through the walls, and for a moment I thought the maze itself was going to swallow me whole. The walls creaked, groaned, and I felt someone behind me. I turned, my blood freezing in my veins. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure of my father, Corvin. His form was flickering, unstable, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow as though he had been torn from the depths of the labyrinth itself. I could feel the air growing colder, the walls pressing in tighter around me, and I knew that this wasn't just a trick of the maze. It was him. "Father?" I gasped, the word choking in my throat. My hands trembled, my legs unsteady, but I couldn't look away. Why are you here?" His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, of love, but then it was gone, replaced by something colder, something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't be here, Ren," he said, his voice a rasp, barely a whisper. "I didn't want you to find this place." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The labyrinth, the truth, the artifact. My heart pounded, and I stepped forward, despite the growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. "Why?" I demanded. "Why did you leave me? Why did you disappear? Why did you build this place?" The anger that had been simmering inside me for years boiled over, spilling out in a torrent. "What are you hiding? What's in here, Father?" Corvin didn't move. His form flickered again, growing fainter, but his gaze remained locked on mine, his eyes hollow with a sadness that felt as old as the labyrinth itself. "I tried to protect you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I could keep you safe from them, from what was inside." He stepped forward, and I could feel the chill in the air as though the labyrinth itself was closing in around us. The maze wasn't meant to be this way. It was meant to keep the darkness at bay, but it grew, it fed, and it took me with it. It took everything. "What darkness?" I shouted, my voice cracking with frustration. "What the hell are you talking about, Corvin?" He reached for me, his hand shaking, but when I moved to meet him, his form dissipated, flickering like a candle in the wind, leaving only a cold, empty space in his wake. His last words lingered in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. "It's not just a maze, Ren. It's a prison for something much worse than you know." The silence that followed his disappearance was crushing. The walls groaned in response to his absence, the air pressing tighter around me. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't process it. The maze wasn't just a labyrinth, it was a containment. But for what? I turned back to the pedestal, to the artifact that now seemed darker, more insidious than before. It wasn't just a relic, a forgotten treasure. It was the key to the prison Corvin had created. To the thing he had locked away, something so dangerous that it could destroy everything. I had no choice. I reached out again, my fingers trembling as I grasped the cold, pulsing object. And the moment I touched it, everything around me exploded into chaos. The labyrinth shook, the walls groaned in agony, and I heard a voice, a whisper in the dark, a voice that had no face, no form, but a presence that filled the room, the maze. "You shouldn't have come." And then, all went black. I had learned the truth. But the truth wasn't something I could ever escape. The maze had me now. And whatever it had been hiding was coming for me. For all of us. The artifact pulsed in my hands, its cold energy coursing through me, pushing and pulling at my very core. The labyrinth around me seemed to close in, the walls groaning as they shifted, responding to my hesitation, my indecision. I could feel it. The labyrinth wasn't just a maze of stone, not anymore. It had become something far more sinister, something alive. It fed on my fear, my doubt, and now it wanted me to choose. There was no escaping it, no running. Before me, the heart of the maze stood like a dark promise, the pedestal bathed in an eerie light, the artifact pulsing softly in time with my heartbeat. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a symbol of the power that had consumed my father, that had twisted this entire place into a prison. But what I hadn't realized, what I hadn't understood, was that by finding the artifact, I had also found the truth that would either destroy everything or keep me trapped forever. The walls groaned louder now, the air thick with a heavy, suffocating pressure. I couldn't breathe, my chest was tight with the weight of what I had to do. And then I heard it. A voice. Corvin's voice. Ren. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the dark. But it was unmistakable. His voice, my father's voice, echoed through the space, cutting through the suffocating silence, sending a shiver down my spine. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned, searching for him. But there was nothing. And then, there he was. His form flickered into view, a ghostly projection of my father, distorted and flickering in the dim light, as if he were struggling to hold his shape in the labyrinth's grip. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes empty of life, filled with something else, something terrifying. I wanted to reach out to him, to ask him why, to beg him for answers, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. My hands shook with a cold I couldn't shake. "Father?" I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely a breath. "Where have you been? What is this place?" Corvin's eyes locked onto mine, but there was no recognition in them, no comfort, only a deep sorrow. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to falter, as if they were torn from him with great pain. "You shouldn't have come here, Ren," he said, his voice weak, trembling. "I never wanted you to find this place. I didn't want you to know the truth. The truth." I stepped forward, my body moving against my will, drawn to him, but as I reached out, his form wavered. The walls groaned, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones as the labyrinth responded, as if it were tightening its grip on us both. "Father, please," I gasped, my voice cracking. "Why did you leave me? Why didn't you tell me what you were doing, what this place was?" His face twisted with pain, the shadows around him thickening, warping as though they were consuming him. His voice came again, quieter this time, almost a whisper against the oppressive silence of the labyrinth. "I thought I could protect you," he said, his words breaking like glass. "I thought I could keep you safe. But the maze..." He paused, his form flickering as if the very act of speaking was taking him further from me. "It feeds on fear, Ren. It feeds on me." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into my chest like lead. "The maze? It's not just a place?" My mind reeled with confusion. What was he saying? "No," Corvin whispered, his face drawn in anguish. "I built it to trap them, to trap it." His eyes locked onto mine, and there was a deep terror there, one that shook me to my core. "I never wanted you to come here, Ren. I never wanted you to see it." I stepped closer, despite the fear twisting inside me. "What is it, Father? What's inside? What are you protecting me from?" The ground beneath us shifted, the air growing thicker, colder, as if the maze itself were responding to my words. Corvin's figure flickered again, the shadows in the room stretching and bending unnaturally. "It's too late," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper now. "The maze is alive, Ren. It has been since the day I created it, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to consume." I could feel it, the labyrinth around us, pulsing with a deep, malevolent energy. It was feeding off our conversation, feeding off our fear. But the worst part, the part that sank into my bones like poison, was that I realized something then. The maze wasn't just a physical prison. It was a manifestation of whatever had been locked away within it. It was a containment. And that was when I understood. The labyrinth was his creation. But it wasn't just stone and walls. It was his curse, and I was a part of it. To destroy the maze meant to destroy him, too. My father, trapped in this prison of his own making, feeding it, feeding them, whatever it was that he had locked away. But if I didn't destroy the maze, if I left it alive, I would never be free. It would continue to twist me, to erase me, to pull me deeper into its grip. I would lose myself to it, just as my father had. The truth was horrifying. I had to choose. Ren. Corvin's voice was barely audible now, his form flickering faster, like a dying flame. If you destroy the maze, you'll destroy me. But if you leave it alive, it will continue to feed on you, on all of us. I stood there, frozen, my hand still gripping the artifact, my heart racing in my chest. I had to make a choice. To end my father's suffering, to free him from the maze's grip, meant to destroy it all, everything he had built, everything he had created. But to leave it alive meant to keep my father trapped in this prison for eternity. I glanced at Amara, standing in the shadows, her face unreadable, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. She knew what had to be done. She knew what the maze was capable of. The walls groaned again, the entire structure of the labyrinth shaking, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to act. And in that moment I knew. I raised the artifact above my head, my hands shaking with fear, with the weight of the choice. And with a final, shuddering breath, I brought it down. The world exploded in light. The maze screamed, a sound like the earth itself cracking open as the stone walls shattered around us. The air turned cold, freezing, suffocating. My father's form flickered one last time, his eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of love, sorrow, and something far darker. And then, with a final cry, the labyrinth collapsed. The walls crumbled into nothingness, the floor beneath me shattering, and everything I had known, the maze, my father, the prison of my past, vanished. I was standing in the remains of what was once the heart of the maze. Silence fell around me. The weight of the world seemed to lift from my shoulders, but it was replaced by something darker, something hollow. I had made my choice. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The moment I crushed the artifact into the stone floor, it felt like the world itself shattered. Everything around me groaned and cracked like the very bones of the earth breaking. The air was thick with tension, as if the labyrinth had been holding its breath for an eternity, waiting for me to make my choice. The stone walls that had loomed over me like a suffocating force trembled, their jagged edges splintering into dust. The ground beneath me shifted violently, shaking as if the maze itself were dying. I staggered back, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat, unable to tear my eyes away from the chaos unfolding around me. The labyrinth, this nightmarish prison, this twisted monstrosity that had consumed me for so long, was falling apart. The walls groaned in agony, splitting open like the flesh of a dying beast, and I could feel the vibrations of its death rumbling through my very bones. The air turned cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. The darkness that had once seemed so oppressive, so suffocating, now felt like it was retreating, pulling back into itself. The shadows receded from the walls, curling away like smoke. There was a silence, a deep, hollow quiet, and I stood there, breathless, my mind racing, trying to process what was happening. It was over. The maze was crumbling. But what came next? And then, amidst the wreckage, the strangest thing happened. A faint light began to pulse in the distance, soft at first, like the first glimmer of dawn creeping through the cracks of the night. I blinked, not sure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Was it part of the collapse? Was the maze fighting back, unwilling to die? But no, this light. It wasn't from the maze. It was something else, something alive. I forced myself forward, unsure of my legs, as I stumbled through the crumbling debris. The ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting with every step, but I kept moving, drawn toward the light. My heart, still hammering in my chest, began to calm. There was something in the air, something that felt different, better. The suffocating weight that had followed me through the maze, that had twisted my thoughts, was starting to lift. And then, I saw it. At the center of the room, where the pedestal had once stood, there was a tree. I blinked, not sure if my mind had gone insane. A tree? In the heart of the labyrinth? It was alive, the leaves swaying as if stirred by a breeze that wasn't there, its branches reaching upward, twisting toward an unseen sky. I took another step forward, my breath catching in my throat. The tree's bark was dark, almost silver, and its leaves shimmered faintly, as if glowing with a light that came from within. But what really caught my attention was the ground around it. The earth beneath the tree was soft, rich, fertile, a stark contrast to the cracked stone and suffocating darkness that had surrounded me for so long. The maze was dying, yes, but this was something else. This was life. I wasn't sure whether to approach it or whether it was some cruel illusion conjured by the dying labyrinth. But as I stood there, staring at the tree, I felt something stirring within me, a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. Hope. Amara stepped up beside me, her footsteps soft on the shifting ground. She too had been watching the tree, and I could see the awe in her expression. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, taking in the impossible sight before us. "What is this?" she whispered, as if afraid to disturb the quiet beauty of it all. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the tree. "I don't know," I murmured, "but it feels alive." My voice cracked, the weight of everything I had just destroyed pressing down on me. My father, Corvin, was gone. The maze was gone. The walls, the shadows, the suffocating darkness. All of it had crumbled to dust. And with it, the part of me that had been trapped in this place for so long was free. But there was something else. The labyrinth wasn't just dead, it was changing. The air around us felt lighter, fresher, and the oppressive atmosphere that had consumed me was starting to fade. I could breathe again, I could think clearly again. The maze had fallen, yes, but in its place, something new was rising. I took a step toward the tree, my hand trembling as I reached for its branches. There was something in the air now, something warm, something that felt like sunlight, even though there was no sky above us, no light filtering through the trees. It was like a promise, a hope for something better. Amara followed my lead, her expression still unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something new. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the tree's bark. "This wasn't what I expected," she said, her voice softer now, her tone unguarded. I thought the maze would destroy us. But this," she let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing. "This is hope." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The maze was gone. My father, he was gone. I had destroyed it all. But here, in the heart of the ruins where darkness had once held sway, something new was taking root, something alive. The tree stood there, quietly, its branches swaying in a wind that wasn't there, its leaves shimmering like stars in the dark. The roots spread wide, pulling the fertile soil beneath it into a cradle of life. And in that moment I understood. I had made my choice. I had destroyed the maze. I had freed my father from the prison he had built to keep us safe. But I had also destroyed the part of him that lived within the walls. And in doing so, I had freed myself too. But more than that, the labyrinth's fall wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of something new. Something that could grow. Something that could live. And for the first time since I had entered the maze, I felt a flicker of real hope. A feeling I hadn't known in years. The labyrinth was gone. But this was a new beginning. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel trapped anymore. I was free.